Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, January the 6th, 2026. New year, but most subjects seem to reappear every year. And one of the interesting subjects that we've often covered on this show is how social change happens. A few years ago, we had the great Harvard-based behavioral economist Cass Sunstein on the show, talking about how social change happens. Last year, actually, was on the show talking about his version of liberalism and why that needs defending. Sunstein is the co-author, of course, of the book Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, a book that's had a great deal of influence, particularly on social policy in terms of trying to encourage people to do what governments think they should do, although not everyone is in the nudge behavioral economics camp. My guest today is the co-author of perhaps a book we might describe as anti-nudge. It's called It's On You. It's by Nick Chater and George Lowenstein. It's out at the end of the month. And Nick Chater is joining us from Oxford. He teaches at Warwick University in the UK. Nick, congratulations on the new book. Are you the anti-Sunstein, the anti-nudger? Is that the heart of this book?
I think that's a slightly sort of confrontational way of putting it, but there is some truth in that, in the sense that both George and I, when we started thinking about behavioural policy from a psychological point of view, we started off very much from the same perspective that the book Nudge that gives. So in fact, George was involved in a meeting which occurred a bit before Nudge, which I think Thaler, possibly Sunstein, was also in. And there were a couple of big papers coming out of that, one which George was involved with, one which is a very famous paper by Sunstein and Thaler, which led to the book. So there's this sort of early history, which I wasn't part of at all, of developing the idea that there might be a way of influencing public policy which doesn't use those old heavy-handed tools of regulation, taxes, subsidies, and so on, but instead uses the quirks of human psychology. So the sort of insight, but I think we've come to be a bit dispirited by the effectiveness of this insight, but the insight was that humans make innumerable decisions due to their own cognitive failings. Sometimes those decisions might be changed by framing and describing the decision in different ways, just giving people the same choices essentially, but just framed and sort of couched in different terms. And if we could essentially make it easy for people to do the quote right thing, then maybe we could get quite different behavior in aggregate, different social outcomes, without actually those sort of heavy-handed, big government type measures. That was the hope in Nudge, and I think the experience I think that George and I have had in the last, I suppose, 15 years or so has been though starting off very enthusiastic in this program, we found it very hard to actually make it work, and we've come round to thinking that the systemic factors, the old-fashioned regulatory and taxes and subsidies and structural organizational governmental factors are actually big forces which individual behavior can scarcely touch. So I think I wouldn't say we're anti-nudge, but we're not as
you're nudge skeptic, shall we say?
Yeah,
let's get a bit more concrete. That was an interesting. You're based in the UK. An interesting piece this morning on the BBC's website about what it calls the myth of willpower, and of course, in 2026, there's a junk food, television, and online advert ban in the UK. Let's talk about fast food and nudge and government policy and this idea of willpower. I guess the classic version is that we all have willpower and we need to control ourselves when it comes to fast food. Everybody knows it's not very good for you. Everyone knows it's delicious. We'd like to eat it. Most people don't want to be fat. Most people don't want to be unhealthy. So we should be able to control ourselves. But if indeed there is such a thing as the myth of willpower, then maybe we should be banning junk food television advertising. Is that the kind of example, Nick, that you bring up in the book about the need for regulation?
Yes, absolutely. I think the myth of willpower is actually a very, very interesting one, because sort of moment by moment, one can have the sense that one can exert willpower sort of day by day and say, I will not eat this particular food. I'll hold back, and the whole vast diet industry is all about trying to help us manage our food intake more effectively. And the general story from research over decades, not this my area of specialism, so it's very much a secondary view of this, but the general story is that in aggregate over many years, almost all of these interventions for each individual don't really work very well. In fact, scarcely work at all for most people. And also, if at an aggregate level, looking at the whole of society, and a strategy which says we've got a real junk food problem, we've got an obesity problem, we've got people not having nutritious diets. What we need is more people with greater willpower to somehow instill or help them get higher levels of willpower. Is a sort of hopeless strategy. And it's sort of hopeless even at the individual level. It's for me to think what I need is really toughen up and get more and more moral fiber and fight back against the continual tide of tasty looking things I shouldn't be eating. I mean, that's probably going to have marginal effect. But as a sort of strategy, if you're thinking about your if you're somebody worried about public health in general, that's just really hopeless. And the reason it's hopeless, one simple observation which makes one feel it must be hopeless, is that human beings don't change very much. I mean, we have the same temptations and the same lack of willpower, or willpower we've always had. But what we are seeing is that our the levels of obesity and indeed eating disorders of all kinds and malnutrition of certain kinds in certain groups of people, these things are increasing quite quickly across many countries in the world. So it can't be that the individual human psychology is changing. It's something structural is happening. And the kind of thing that's happening is that the nature of the food environment is changing. Different kinds of food are being developed, different kinds of foods are becoming very cheap. They weren't cheap before. Ultra-processed foods are becoming more ubiquitous and so on. So I think the thought is that the humans are pretty constant. When things start to change socially, when a problem starts to arise, it's probably something more structural than individual that is the nature of the cause there.
Your book has a very provocative subtitle, Nick. It's How Corporations and Behavioral Scientists Have Convinced Us that We're to Blame for Society's Deepest Problems. Let's focus. I mean, the behavioral economists, I guess, have an interest in the sense that they want us to read their books, which goes without saying. So I don't necessarily blame Thaler or Sunstein for this, but
and I should say, by the way, so
the implications in your book is that it's corporations, fast food companies, cigarette companies, gambling companies. They want us to believe that we have such a thing as willpower because they know we don't, and they know that they can take advantage of you. Is that fair? Is that your argument in this book?
I think that is absolutely part of our argument. Yes. So if let's take something like gambling, or indeed alcohol, tobacco, all of these have the same characteristics. The industry itself, so the gambling would be a good example. Gambling industries worked really hard to figure out ways that are extremely attractive to people to spend their time gambling, and where they obviously lose a lot of money because the gambling industry, it's a zero-sum game. If the gambling industry makes money, the punters in aggregate must be losing. And so there's an inordinate amount of work cleverly designing, for example, certain kinds of slot machines and so on. Fixed odd betting terminals were a big thing in the UK, where people can lose, play and have no doubt momentarily very adrenalized time, but lose at a very rapid rate. And at the same time as that, there's a message going out saying, now, of course, you gamblers, if the fun stops, stop. I think it's actually the phrase in the UK gambling industry promotional material. If the fun stops, it's we're there to help you not have a problem with gambling. And so the story is that it's obviously it's up to you, but we're on your side as an industry, trying to help you not tip over into problem gambling, and certainly not to lose too much money. But at the same time, they're going to spend a great deal of resources, a huge amount of advertising, a huge amount of sponsorship, but crucially designing gambling opportunities, which you're going to find very difficult to resist. And there's, I'm no expert in the gambling industry. But
okay, so I take your point, Nick, but What is our responsibility then? Your book is entitled "It's on You," which is, of course, ironic, suggesting that it isn't really on us, or it shouldn't be on us. Where does our individual responsibility begin or even end? I mean, if you're suggesting that we don't have such a thing as willpower, then is nothing on us? Are we completely irrelevant? Is there no such thing as agency?
Yeah, I don't want to go that far. So I think the perspective, if we think about ourselves as in terms of running our own lives, rather than thinking about how we're going to run society. So I think we have two roles, I suppose. I think of us as individuals having two roles. One is thinking, how am I going to, as it were, advise myself and the people around me, and how are they going to advise me? How are we going to try and navigate the world we're in? And in that sort of thinking of myself as a tiny minnow in a vast sea, all I can do is say, well, the rules are the rules. The world works the way it does, and I just have to work with it. So I'm going to be advising myself, don't get sucked into all sorts of forms of gambling. Try to moderate your diet and so on and so on. I'm going to be trying to do that, and I think it's not that individuals don't have some agency, because people vary. They vary quite a lot. So it's not that individual characteristics don't matter, although we don't really have too much control over them. So, but anyway, that's.
I mean, it sounds to me like you're leading people on with this book. You say it's on you, how corporations and behavioral scientists have convinced us that we're to blame for society's deepest problems. But when I've asked you about this question, I won't say you're a bit of a nudger yourself, but you're a little bit, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, you've got to come out and clearly say what you think, Nick. Otherwise you're misleading the public on this new book. I mean, what do you really think? Is it on us, or is it on corporations and behavioral scientists?
So let me get to the second point. So the first point is that if I'm thinking about what I advise myself to do or what I advise my friends to do, that's one thing. But the thing that really matters is how we as citizens try to shape the society we live in. And there, of course, one of the things we do is vote. One of the things we do is campaign and try to change social policy. Of course, that's a very difficult, hard thing to do. But I think that's the thing that really is really critical. So I as a single individual, none of us as individuals have an inordinate power to shape the way the rules by which we live. But what I would want us to do is to think, well, actually, if we're thinking, do we want to live in a world where the rules are extremely both loose and controlled by powerful forces who are going to be pushing us, trying to shape those rules to their own profit, or do we want those rules to be shaped around what will lead to the best outcomes for all of us as individuals? That's the sort of the question I'm wanting people to ask. So I want people to be thinking, if they read this book, well, hang on, maybe having a bit more regulation of the gambling industry, alcohol industry, tobacco industry, fossil fuel industry, maybe some of those things need to be sharpened up quite a lot. We collectively need to be pushing for that. Even though there is, and again, against the argument that, well, really, the rules can be as loose as you like, and we individually have just got to step up, sort of behaviour by behaviour. So I'm wanting the answer to be active citizens pushing for social change collectively, rather than saying it's over to me as an individual and you as an individual to consume slightly differently, live slightly more healthy lives.
Citizens themselves, Nick, want, so to speak, their cake and eat it. They're always complaining about corporations, but they want access to all the best online stuff. They want to have the choice to gamble online, to eat whatever they want, to drink whatever they want, to smoke whatever they want. So isn't there a problem also with individuals here? I mean, the you in your title?
I really think this is a deep and it's a deeply political and not therefore sort of academically solvable issue. This, so I think if it could be that we collectively as a society, in a way that's not overly distorted by powerful forces. I think at the moment we are being very heavily, through political agendas, being heavily skewed by a great deal of money in politics, which is coming, of course, from many of the big corporations. But it could be that we collectively decide actually that, and we clearly do in many cases, actually there are things that we think are probably not a good idea, but we're going to allow them. We think that it's more important to have the freedom to allow ourselves to certain latitude. So not many of us want to ban gambling completely. Trying to ban alcohol has turned out to be a complete disaster, and we probably won't be able to do that either. So there are limits. Equally, we don't want to have a complete free for all. Now, I think the question, there's not really a sort of academic answer to the question how tight or loose do we want our laws to be. But I think the question I want people to think about is, what should those rules be like to maximize our welfare as citizens, and not to allow those rules to be shaped by powerful forces which are primarily interested in profit. Not, I should say, because they're evil. This is just, again,
Can you give me some examples? You keep on talking about these corporations focusing on profit. Give me some examples of companies you think who are compounding what you call in your subtitle society's deepest problems.
Well, I think, I mean, one example we haven't talked about so far, but an obvious one is the whole of the fossil fuel industry, almost entirely, really. And again, this is not, I should really stress, this is not because corporations are evil or the people running corporations are evil. This is because of the power of it's a sort of a system that they are part of, we're all part of. And given the set of rules that they're working within, and we're all working within, their impetus, maybe some people would say even their sort of inevitable objective is to make money for their shareholders, and therefore they're going to act in such a way as to try to achieve that, and that's going to involve where it's allowed, by creating political leverage by lobbying. And,
yeah, but if they were around, I don't want to represent fossil fuel necessarily in this debate, Nick, but if we had someone from the fossil fuel industry on the show, they would say, well, we're not convinced that there aren't going to be solutions to global warming, that we're investing in solar energy, in wind power. So things are actually a lot more complicated. In other words, this title of yours have convinced us that we're to blame for society's deepest problems. The idea of society's deepest problems is a deeply subjective notion. I mean, who's to determine what society's deepest problems are?
Yeah, of course, these things aren't completely given. But I think if you take the oil industry, the amount of resources that they have put into alternative energy sort of sources is pretty small. So at the same time as saying, well, we're spending a little bit of time looking at bioenergy, or we're doing a little bit of wind and solar. In reality, the big money is going into development of further oil fields and the exploitation of existing oil fields, and a great deal of lobbying money has gone into trying to shape international climate agreements and to shape government policy in Western countries, especially in the US, where it's particularly possible to put a great deal of money into politics with effects. Though that's really where the leverage is. So, and I don't think that's surprising or somehow evil, or it's sort of inevitable, really. If you have a system where you can buy political power with money, which you have, then that's going to.
Right, you're right. Of course, this is very political issue. Cato Institute recently ran a piece about Nudge. Cato is a more libertarian-leaning institution. Are you suggesting then that the Chinese model, which certainly isn't democratic, which produces a kind of enlightenment from above, or a certain Chinese-centric version of enlightenment, where when it comes to fossil fuel, for example, the Chinese are investing massively in solar energy, in contrast, say, to the US or the UK. Are you suggesting that in political terms, there is an argument for the Chinese model, for an enlightened authoritarianism?
Well, again, this is probably beyond the scope of our book, but in my own personal opinion, absolutely not. No. So I'm very, very wary of any central authority determining what's, as it were, good for all of us and imposing it. So I would very much want to see the direction of travel as being, we as a society, we the citizens of a society have to think, what rules do we want to live by? And the trick is realizing that is under our control to some degree. We want to.
You keep on saying that we as a society want to figure out what rules. I always hear that, but what exactly does that mean? We vote. How else do we do that? Well,
we do. I mean, we have. If you think historically, there have been enormous changes over history, from the end of slavery, civil rights, and so on and so on. These vast political changes, but huge widening of the franchise. These things have not. It's not just voting. It's campaigning on specific issues, and we've seen that with multitudes of specific issues in the last few decades. So I think it's not vote, and also, of course, there's being an engaged citizenry and making our views felt, and that happens a lot. It's not that people are silent in these things. And I think one of the things we should be worried about, and I don't think there's a magic solution. I mean, there's no, if you're not someone who believes in authoritarian solutions and you believe things have to ultimately happen from the bottom up, which this isn't pretty part of the book, but this is something I certainly do think, then there isn't going to be an answer to how do we all get together and make the world better in a flash. I mean, that's just it's just an impossible task, unfortunately. And of course, because it's a collective effort. One of the things we should be most worried about, most focused on as a society, is where are there small, powerful forces which are going to distort that process. So if we're going to collectively decide how we want to run our lives, we want to be very wary of very powerful forces which can disproportionately push things in directions that are valuable to them. So I mean, one example of that would be fossil fuel industries with a great deal of lobbying power. We might say the same, not that I'm any expert on the latest developments, we might say the same with cryptocurrencies or big tech or whatever. There are clearly cases where there are powerful voices which have a small number of people they're representing, or whose interests they're representing, but they have a disproportionate amount of power. That's the kind of thing we should be as a democratic society, we should be very worried about that. So just having to be able to vote every 4 or 5 years isn't enough of a counterweight.
Yeah, no, I take your point, and I perhaps in some ways don't disagree with you. And yet we live, for better or worse, Nick, we live in an age where conspiracy theories are ubiquitous. We've had people on the show arguing that Jeffrey Epstein, for example, will be the person of 2026 because he was a Mossad agent or this or that. Or there are aliens from outer space about to invade or already invaded. Capitalist companies, this group, this other or some other group is destroying our society. Aren't you just compounding that paranoia, that conspiracy that whether it's corporations or behavioral scientists have convinced us that we innocent humans, that we're to blame, when in fact we should indeed be taking responsibility. And the problem these days is no one's taking responsibility for any of their actions, and they're actually blaming everyone else, whether it's corporations or advertisers or other people.
Well, I think the thought that we don't take sufficient responsibility for our own actions, I think is only true at the margins, really. I think on the whole, people are always largely in charge of, from their own perspective, that we're largely in charge of our own lives, and I can't unilaterally shift the rules by which society operates. So I'm happy to work with the society I've got, but if we're thinking from a political point of view, if we're thinking, what should we all be, what criteria we should be using to decide what rules we want to have. I think we should be thinking we want to have rules that are going to be, as it were, good for all of us, and not, or being very wary of rules that are being imposed upon us by particular vested interest. Now, of course, one might say, well, hang on, that sounds, I mean, it's not really a conspiracy theory, but it's it's just another one of those evil corporations. Good
for all of us. Again, you throw these terms around. I know what it means. What does good for all of us mean?
Well, I think literally all is probably too strong, but where we're, for example, I think it's easier to see it in the negative. You can see the sort of opposite. So if you're taking a situation where a small number of, let's take the case of AI. This is a hypothetical case where none of us have a clue where AI is going. And I think in many ways it's the most extraordinarily exciting thing, but also quite terrifying. But just suppose it's the case. Suppose it's the case that there's a 10% risk that artificial general intelligence will take over humanity and essentially enslave us or wipe us out or whatever. I have no idea what that figure should be. Maybe it's 0.001%. Maybe it's 50%. I have no idea. Although Jeff Hinton, who is one of the most important figures in this, would say it's quite a high figure. But suppose we
coming to Jeffrey Hinton, he was on the show a couple of months ago, and I asked him the exact question, and he has a number, 15%. And I said, Jeffrey, how did you get to that number? And he acknowledged that he had absolutely no idea, so he just threw it out. So it's an entirely arbitrary number.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say it's a mysterious number. We don't know where it is, but it might be quite big. And we say, well, who is going to expose us, all of our ourselves, our children, our grandchildren? Who's going to expose us to that risk, and what right do they have to do it? And one might suspect that actually the people who are going to do that represent a very, very tiny number of people of interest indeed. So there are a small number of people, mostly in the Silicon Valley area, who are keen to drive forward towards what might turn out to be total safety or even nirvana, but might turn out to push humanity over a precipice. And it seems to me that that's a case where we, as a society at large, need to be in that conversation. It cannot be left.
It's very unconvincing. I have to admit, Nick, this is incredibly unconvincing. Let's take the example of the Industrial Revolution. So had we be having this conversation in the mid-19th century, you might have someone, and there were many people who said, Industrial Revolution, this new technology is going to destroy the world. It's going to destroy civilization. It's going to destroy all value. And you might have someone like Geoff Hinton, who actually had no idea of what was the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, because nobody did, and no one does on the AI revolution. And say, well, that's 15% chance it will destroy everything of value, so we better stop it. I mean, isn't that the nature of human history, that we got to take risks? Well, I think we don't quite know where we're going. And if you take this sort of doomist existential view, then all progress itself becomes a threat.
I think that's the opposite of the way I'd read it. So I'd have thought the right reading of that perspective would be to say, if you've got a risk of an unknown but potentially quite large kind, then you need to potentially, you might want to still develop the technology, but you need to be developing in an extremely careful and measured way. So I mean, the atomic bomb would be another example where we've actually worked pretty hard to reduce nuclear proliferation. We could have said, well, here it comes, everyone's going to have atomic weapons, nuclear war is inevitable, and that, I mean, thankfully that hasn't yet happened. We hope it never does. But it's, we worked really hard because we've seen that there's a possibility of destroying civilizations. We know it. But the point, so I think we should be extremely careful. But the point I want to raise here is that, want to stress, is that this is a decision that shouldn't be made sort of willy-nilly by a small number of people in Silicon Valley or anywhere else who are representing their own immediate commercial and just personal interests and predilections, which are not, they're perfectly right within their rights to have. It's just that it affects us all, and we should all be in that game. So you were asking, so to what extent, how does it make sense of the common good? And of course, there's no perfect answer to that. But where you have small numbers of interests who are potentially threatening sort of disaster, as it might be, we don't know, then that's a case where a conversation which doesn't involve the mass of humanity is a conversation that's gone horribly awry. And if we keep rolling dice, thinking hopefully we won't throw a one, but once eventually we will throw a one, and then that'll be the end of it. So I think we need to be extremely. I take a very different perspective there.
I agree with you on the atomic weapon analogy, but let's talk about AI then. So you suggest, and people like Hinton agree, and they're some of the fathers of this new technology, that there is a chance that it will destroy civilization, whatever civilization is. Some people wonder whether there really is such a thing as civilization. You suggest that there are interests in Silicon Valley which pursuing this. Of course, it's true, although some of the largest Silicon Valley companies are public companies that are owned by many tens, hundreds of thousands of investors. What should happen with AI? You keep on talking about this kind of Rousseauan notion of the general interest, that society has some notion of what benefits it. What should happen with AI? Should we have citizen assemblies, for example? I mean, you keep on saying that this is ultimately a political issue, but you're a business professor, and you've written a book implicitly, at least, about politics. How should AI be dealt with? Should it be dealt with experts like Geoffrey Hinton, or just ordinary people? Nobody quite understands, when it comes to something like AI, how it's actually going to impact their lives. Some people argue that it will benefit people in the long run. Some people suggest that it won't. Nobody knows.
No. I mean, I think I'm a great believer in the inherent unpredictability of almost everything in human history. The thought that we can sort of figure it out, decide definitively, is, I think, that's sadly a hopeless task. But what we do need to do is to be having a variety of different debates and cautious and thoughtful strategies put in place, but to avoid what might be calamitous. I don't want to. And the book isn't about AI. It's about systems generally. It's about the idea that the rules that we set up are things that are really going to decisively determine what happens, and it's not individual responsibility has a relatively small part to play. And I think AI is a case where I would be arguing for a very much larger role for government involvement in AI technology. So just having oversight of what the algorithms are doing, what the dangers might be, not leaving that just to private companies, but having very careful oversight of that, as we do with nuclear weapons. We don't have private companies with nuclear weapons. I think that's probably just as well. It's a similar, possibly a technology of similar danger, but also huge opportunity. I'm not actually an AI doomsayer, as it happens, but I think there's the fact that in fact there's very little. I mean, essentially the public debate is sort of muted because the reality is that the big private companies just totally control this space. They also have sufficient political power that there's really no realistic chance of regulating them effectively.
And with AI, of course, we don't know what will happen. Let's take the social media example. Australia recently banned social media use for kids. The French are also planning a similar sort of thing. When social media came about 20 years ago, people were quite optimistic about deepening democracy, enabling citizen resistance in the Middle East, in North Africa, in much of the non-democratic world. That doesn't seem to have happened, and most people now are rather pessimistic on the impact of social media. And as I said, the Australians have banned it for kids. The French are thinking of banning it. What does the history of social media tell us about this issue of when government should and shouldn't step in? Should governments, I mean, in retrospect, hindsight, of course, Nick, is always 20/20, but with hindsight, should governments have controlled social media more aggressively when Facebook and Twitter launched in 2006, 2006, 2007?
Yeah, I think I think your hindsight 2020 point is absolutely right. It was very hard to know how these things would develop, and it always is with the technologies. So if we think about the development of medicine through the sort of late 19th century and early 20th century, there was extraordinary flourishing of all kinds of crazy stuff. Many of things extremely damaging, many of things completely complete snake oil. Also genuinely remarkable discoveries, penicillin and so on. And there were all sorts of just this huge plethora of things that worked and didn't work, and all kinds of surgical procedures which did more harm than good, and others did fantastic amounts of good. Just total chaos. And we've eventually worked our way towards a really extremely heavily regulated medical sector. We might even say too much, but anyway, it's very, very heavily regulated pharmaceutical and medical sector. I would say aircraft would be another one. So initially aircraft were much more hazardous things to drive around than they are now, or to fly. And now there's been extremely vigorous process of regulation, which has gradually...
no one's ever blamed as an aircraft. In the best of cases, no one's ever blamed human beings when their aircraft crashes.
Yeah, but the systems that maintain air safety are unbelievably complicated, and they're a really interesting, intricate relationship between the private and public sector. So it's not that all airlines are publicly owned, of course, but they are all very heavily and carefully and thoughtfully regulated. And that process of regulation, it sort of seems inevitable in retrospect. It seems like, well, of course, you wouldn't have a medical or an airline industry without government oversight and ultimately democratic accountability. That would be crazy. None of us would want that. But it took a long time to get going, and it's an enormous battle to create such regulatory systems. And of course, the incumbents never liked it. So if you're trying to regulate the airline industry are likely to be extremely hostile to this, or at least many aspects of it, as you're going along, because they're very happy to determine things as they will, and the
although I somehow
medicine and pharmaceutical companies are the
I
same.
mean, one wonders. I don't want to turn this into a conversation about the airline industry, but I assume the airline industry is pretty good, pretty happy with the fact that there aren't crashes, and they certainly wouldn't want an unregulated industry that would enable crashing.
No. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, actually, is that often once industries are regulated, it's actually a sort of it's a common good for everybody. So
I keep on
companies themselves.
I'm asking you for your message in this book, and you keep on dodging the question, Nick. Are you suggesting then that the social media industry or AI or the fast food industry should be as heavily regulated as the airline industry? Is that the argument in the book?
I think the question, it has to be done on a case by case basis. But where you're seeing
yes or no, I
think it's
a book about it.
We clearly need more regulation for AI, more regulation for tech, a lot more regulation for fossil fuels and the food industry. But exactly where we find that balance, that's a political question. But I say a bit more contentious, Drew, which I think, but is vastly more regulation of the degree to which corporations have control of the political process. So taking money out of politics is probably one of the most, and taking money out of the control of the media. These are really critical things if you're going to have a well-regulated democratic debate where we as a society can figure out what do we want without having very powerful, commercially very deep-pocketed forces pushing the debate around.
And is your model for that? Again, you keep on dodging this question because I just don't buy it, and I don't see any evidence. Give me an example of when society actually debated something. You talked about civil rights in the US, but of course that created a civil war, and even now there's a kind of unspoken civil war going on between right and left in the US, certainly when it comes to civil rights and race. So give me an example of when society actually debated something in a civil, coherent, responsible way.
Well, actually, I think there are a lot, but most of them do have at the edges. They have genuine conflict.
Okay, but give me an example in the UK of when something was really coherently debated.
Well, I suppose the climate change targets that the UK adopted, which are now being slightly nibbled at the edges. I mean, that's a really extraordinary thing that a country that was one of the major coal producers not too long ago was actually trying to move towards a rather heroic and ambitious target of net zero carbon emissions by 2015. But that was 2050. But that was something where there was actually a great deal of public debate and agonizing, and then obviously not everybody's happy, and there's still sort of toing and froing. But that's the whole sort of shift towards being more concerned about the environment. I think that's something that's been an enormous shift. I mean, move towards gay marriage, the move towards general creation of better opportunities for women. And these are things that have been a long run.
I wonder whether all these arguments, people always make these arguments for stuff that they agree with. What about Brexit? I'm guessing you probably weren't a big fan of Brexit. Wasn't that a healthy debate too? And the British decided they didn't want to be part of the EU.
I think debates, you've got to. I think that's true. I think I'm not personally a believer that Brexit has been advantageous for Britain or Europe or anyone else. But I mean, yes, I think the perspective that if we have reasoned and thoughtful debates, sometimes those debates are going to come out the way any individual in society that may think that's not what I thought, and you've got to respect the outcome.
Finally, Nick, this is a really interesting and important subject. What about all these drugs when it comes to, we're entering a new age, not just of AI, but an increasingly drug-centric or medical drug-centric world where we can control ourselves. There's a junk food ban now on TV, but some people, maybe even from the fast food industry, would say, well, you can eat or you can take now these diet pills, which will allow you to control yourself. What is your book, or what are your thoughts on these new drugs, which enable us to do stuff that perhaps our willpower on its own doesn't enable. Certainly dieting, maybe even giving up alcohol and gambling, which I'm assuming will have drugs for those not far down the line. It seems as if we're increasingly living in what Huxley warned us in the 1930s was a brave new world.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and my natural instinct is to think, if we're worried about, I mean, for example, imagine we live in a world where bridges don't have rails and people keep falling off them. We might say, well, we could regulate and have rails on our bridges, which might be a sensible thing to do. Or we might say, oh, we need to give people, special supplements to help them be more attentive or improve their vision, or so they won't fall off. And I think, but for most problems, trying to stop the problem arising in the first place is usually just cheaper, simpler, better for everybody than accepting the problem is going to arise and then trying to fix it post hoc. So probably having a food environment where it's easier to eat more healthily is probably more the starting point, rather than saying, well, we'll allow a food environment which is incredibly unhealthy, but then we'll try and fix it by this kind of backdoor route. So I think generally try to fix problems at source rather than later on is probably the generally the way most of us would want to go, and I think that would be my instinct. But it's also ultimately, this is a matter of democratic debate. I honestly don't think psychologists and economists have the answer to this. I mean, it's like we as citizens have to think, well, what sort of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world with more temptations and problems, but we'll try and fix them by techno solutions, or do we want to just cut the problem out at the beginning? And I think people will have different opinions about that, legitimately, actually.
Well, you on your X page, you say your image is the mind is flat. I wonder whether rather than that, the mind is fat and maybe should be a bit thinner. Very interesting conversation. Good sport, Nick, to deal with some of my interruptions and criticisms. It's on you, an important subject. Congratulations on the new book. And thank you again. Fascinating conversation.